This is Radio TV Phono Nut, and we recently did a repair video on a Crosley Book radio, which is a hybrid battery-operated radio that contains 3 subminiature tubes and 2 transistors for the audio output stage. Well, here's another rare radio, a Sears Silvertone battery-operated portable from about 1954, maybe early 55. This one here runs off of a 45-volt battery and a 1.5-volt battery, and uses 2 standard miniature tubes and 2 sub-miniature tubes. Cosmetically, it's in decent shape. The brass needs to be polished, and I need to clean this fungus off of these knobs here. I've cleaned some of it off, but I need to clean it in more detail. That's a common problem for radio, TV, record player knobs from the 1950s and into the 60s. Here's the chassis, and as you might expect, very miniaturized. This is probably not going to be an easy one to service. And if you look, you can see the tubes. Here's one of the standard miniature tubes, and another miniature tube behind it, and 2 sub-miniature tubes hiding back there. Here's the tube chart. We have a 1V6 that appears to be the oscillator and mixer tube, a 1T4, which would be the IF amplifier, a 1U5, which would be the first audio and detector tube, and then a sub-miniature 1AG4, which would be the audio output tube. So let's take it down to the bench and put some power to it and see what happens. This thing might just very well play. Now, the Regency TR1 all-transistor radio was the first mass-produced, commercially available transistor radio made that came out in late 1954, about the time that this little tube radio did. So for all intents and purposes, this radio was already obsolete whenever it was made, but you can definitely tell the direction that electronics were going in. This was the real beginning of everything becoming miniaturized. And I'm very impressed that the inside of this radio is clean and not eat up with battery corrosion, which means whoever had this took care of it. There's a strong possibility that it wasn't used much, as in used for maybe a couple of years, and then by that time transistor radios had really started to take off, so this one just got shoved in a drawer and forgotten about and replaced with a much cheaper to operate transistor set. You know, we can look at the knob here and tell there's some wear around the knob, so it's been used some, but not used excessively. Alright, enough rambling on. Let's get it down to the bench and put some power to it and see what happens. Alright, our filament is set to 1.57 volts, that's good, and 44 volts on the B+, so our power supply is working. Now let's connect it to the radio and see what happens. Alright, here we are, power's connected, and pardon me while I sit the camera down so I can reach under here and flip it on. Alright, we're getting a little static from the speaker. And as I tune across the dial, I get absolutely nothing, just a little bit of static when I turn the volume control. So this one's going to require a bit of service. Now, before we go any further, let's check our B+ voltage and filament voltage under load and see what they are. Okay, the A and B voltages are fine. Nothing's leaky or shorted that's dragging it down. You wiggle the tubes and see if that does anything. Now that did something. Now let's tune across the dial and see what I get. Well, how about that? Get some squealing and crap going on. It sounds like a bad bypass capacitor. And this one sounds pretty good for what it is.
Residents have been fighting for voting rights in Congress and local autonomy for 219.
Here's a better look at the tubes with the chassis removed. A little bitty speaker that's what, maybe 1.5, 2 inches, something like that. And here's the underside of the chassis exposing some of the capacitors. This one right here is the electrolytic that I suspect is open and causing the squealing. I see some ceramic disc, which is a good thing because those generally don't go bad. Here's a better view of under the chassis. As you can see, very tight, very miniaturized. I'm sure a lot of old-time radio and TV technicians cussed the first time they ever saw something like this, especially when they were used to working on the nice, big, roomy radio and TV chassis and then have something like this come along. I can hear some of them telling the customer, throw that Tinker toy away and just buy you another radio. And I see a couplet down there, which is an early form of integrated circuit. And I see something else with at least 3 legs on it, so that's probably another one. So yeah, we have a mix of miniature and subminiature tubes, a miniaturized chassis, couplets. So yeah, you could see the direction they were going here. Alright, here's the schematic that I pulled off of the Radio Museum site. We have a 1V6 oscillator and mixer in the same tube, 1T4 IF amp, that's a regular tube, 1U5 detector, AVC and AF amp, which is a regular tube, and then a sub-miniature 1AG4 for the output tube. This set was actually made by a company called Grand Transformer out of Grand Haven, Missouri. I got that information from Chris Cuff, and he said to his knowledge that that's the only radio they ever made for Sears. Now, as far as possible failure points of capacitors, we had this 0.02 microfarad AVC bypass capacitor that could be suspect, and we had this screen grid bypass, which is a 0.02, and the X there indicates that it may not be used on all models. And then we have this 10 microfarad bypass cap on the B plus line that could also be suspect. Alright, in this set it uses an 8 microfarad and it's reading 14.3, which is not uncommon for electrolytics to read higher than normal, especially these older ones. They can read as much as 80 to 100% higher and still be okay, but sometimes that high reading can fool you. That can actually indicate a leaky capacitor, because there's actually several tests for a capacitor, and the 3 main ones are the actual value of the capacitor, which is measured on this meter, ESR test, which is measured on another meter, and leakage test, which is measured on another one. Right now we'll test this capacitor on the old school leakage tester. The capacitance value reads about the same on this one. As far as our leakage test voltages, our lowest voltage, at least marked on the scale, is 20 volts, but I've actually determined that's about 80 volts. And this is a 50 volt capacitor, but these older capacitors I think could take the overage, at least momentarily, better than a newer one could. What I'd like to have is one of the newer Heathkit capacitor testers that has lots of voltage settings from 3 volts all the way on up to 600 volts. What I don't want to do is pay the price that those are currently going for, anywhere from $300, $400, $500, which is nuts. Used to, you could pick up those things at a ham fest for $10 because they were considered old junk, but then people got the idea about reforming their old capacitors, and they discovered those types of capacitor checkers are good for doing that, so that's what ran the price of them up. Now, me personally, I'm not going to reform an old 50 or 60-year-old capacitor unless it's for grins and giggles. Electrolytic capacitors are cheap enough. If one's bad, change it. So if I ever get one of those fancier testers, it's going to have to be at a yard sale or flea market or somewhere. It won't be on eBay unless somebody happens to throw one up for a cheap buy it now and I just happen to catch it in time. Alright, let's throw it over here to the leakage position. Okay, no problems there. And I'll run this down here and discharge it. And I'm embarrassed to say that I've mislaid my ESR meter. I think some days I would lose my head if it wasn't attached, but that's okay because generally it's been my experience with these old caps when the ESR is very high, the capacitance value is very low, so I don't think this is causing our problem. The other things I want to look at are these bypass capacitors. Alright, here's the AVC filter, and this is not a very good sign. No well-defined eye opening. Let's check it for leakage on the 20 volt scale. Yeah, this cap is very leaky and needs to be replaced. Here's the screen bypass capacitor. Still no well-defined eye opening. It's not as leaky as the AVC filter, but it still needs to go. Now here it is on the new capacitance meter, and it's reading 0.02. You might look at that and say, well, gee, that's a good capacitor. I can leave it alone. Well, not necessarily, because this little meter here doesn't have a leakage test function and it doesn't have that capability. Now sometimes when a capacitor is extremely leaky, it'll measure very high on the capacitance meter, and that's because it's taking the capacitor a longer time to discharge than normal, and that fools the meter into thinking it's a higher value capacitor. So with those tests made, I think it's time to go ahead and get rid of these two capacitors. And this 820 ohm resistor that connects between B minus and A minus, or the chassis, it's up in value, 1120 ohms, so yeah, that needs to be replaced. And that's about all I'm going to do to this, unless I just have to do something else. Get rid of these two capacitors. Well, I'll probably go ahead and just change the electrolytic for good measure. Get rid of this resistor, clean the volume pot, clean the tube sockets, and let it go, because I just really don't relish digging into this other section here. If it works good enough, let it be. Size comparison. Black one is a modern 10 microfarad 200 volt. The brown one is a 60-some-odd-year-old, 66-year-old to be exact, 8 microfarad 50 volt. Alright, we have this 1K ohm resistor coming off of the B plus line. It's reading 1.4K, so even at 20% tolerance, that's not too good. 8 to 1200 ohms would be the acceptable range, and according to my elementary school math, 1.4K it doesn't fall within that 800 to 1200 ohm range. Now let's look at the schematic and see where that resistor goes. Alright, looking at our 45 volt input, we just follow the schematic. Go on up here, and we see a 1K ohm resistor that has our 45 volts on one side of it, and the other side of the resistor connects to the oscillator coil, and the other end of that oscillator coil connects to the plate of the oscillator tube. So I guess they're real happy with the gunfire tonight. That's the second one I've heard. So we know that if we got 45 going in and 45 on the plate, there's virtually no current draw through that resistor. But if that resistor goes up too high in value and that B plus gets too low, then our oscillator may not function right. So we're going to replace that. But we're not going to do that tonight. It's getting kind of late, almost 10 p.m., and with all the gunfire around me, I better relocate my butt from the workshop to the house. So hopefully I'll be around tomorrow to complete this video. Okay, we have the capacitor and that resistor replaced. I've sprayed the volume control. Now I'm going to put the cover back on and clean the tube sockets, and hopefully this thing will be good to go. And here's one of the sub-miniature tubes removed from the socket, a Silvertone 1V6, date coded the 40th week of 54, and these tubes were made by Raytheon. Now, unlike the other types of tubes, this is not a keyed socket, which means you can insert it either way, so you want to take note of which way it came out. In this case, the writing goes towards the speaker. And this other sub-miniature tube is the audio output tube. As you can see, it has a rubber band around it. I think that's to prevent microphonics and to provide shock absorption in case this tube happens to get, in case this set is subjected to heavy vibration and the tube happens to make contact with the speaker or the IF can, that rubber band will kind of act as a shock absorber and prevent microphonics and possible damage to the tube. Alright, I'm hearing static. Turn off the interference producing source there.
And if you've lost weight, you gained it back. Come back to see us again. We're here for you. Call us at 696-67. Less lethal munitions. For the first protest was charged this week. He was shot in the head with a beanbag. His brother says he has brain damage as a result. The police chief in the case says Howell was aiming at another protester who was throwing rocks at police in Jackson. Mississippi lawmakers could vote today to remove the Confederate battle emblem from the state flag. This is SRN News.
We've still got a little squealing at the top end of the dial. That may be an alignment issue, or it may be because it's just not happy being operated off of this AC power supply. On batteries, it probably wouldn't do that. Okay, as best I can tell, the dial is tracking pretty close, and this radio seems to be receiving about as good as it's capable of receiving. So I'm not going to mess with the alignment on this. As far as the volume level, it gets as loud as it's supposed to get.
Everybody has options. I don't want to endanger my family. But if you're off and everything, you're going to find some.
Of course, this radio was never meant to be anything high fidelity, and it was never meant to entertain a crowd. This is what's considered to be a personal portable radio, also known as a coat pocket radio. And with this little bitty small speaker and this little small sub-miniature output tube, there's not going to be a whole lot of power there. So I think we're about ready to put this thing back in the cabinet and call it a day. Now, these capacitors are Goodall brand, 0.02 microfarad at 100 volts, date coded the 46th week of 54. Now, for 1954, these are pretty miniaturized, even if they are only 100 volts. This size here is about the size of what your current little yellow 630 volt axle lead capacitors would be. Okay, we're back in the case except for installing the back, of course. And as far as powering the filament won't be any problem. D cells are common enough. But powering the B plus might be a bit of a problem. Yes, 5 9-volt batteries in series would do it, but there doesn't appear to be enough room in the cabinet for 5 9-volt batteries. Now, I believe I can still get the original type 45-volt battery, but I think it's kind of expensive. I'll have to check on that. But once again, this is not going to be a radio that I'm going to be using all the time. This is more or less just a novelty item. You know, if I can find a battery cheap enough, I might outfit it with batteries and use it from time to time, but this is not going to be a regular player.
Wood odor with the best in odor defense. Jay Farner here, CEO of Rocket Mortgage. Making the right financial decisions has never been more important. When you turn to Rocket Mortgage, we can help guide you to those right decisions
and I think they got a little issue with their processor or something.
So now is a great time
to hear that little raspy sound that's in sync with the audio.
Refinance could give you that financial boost you're looking for.
Sort of sounds like a raspy, dragging speaker, but that's not it. It's been that way forever.
Equal housing lender, licensed in all 50 states, and NMLS number 3030.
You must have been busy, but The Odd Couple with Chris Broussard and Rob Parker were breaking this down. DeMarcus Lawrence. You called him out, but DeMarcus Lawrence.
You know, one thing that's a guarantee in today's world, when I turn on to a news talk station or the TV news, what I'm going to hear about is police brutality, Black Lives Matter, racist white people, the Confederate flag, and the coronavirus. And that's pretty much going to consist of what the news is about these days. There's the overmodulated gospel station. And there's the sports station. Oh, and I forgot, NASCAR and Bubba Wallace. That's also a hot topic on the news these days.
7,000 high school students drop out every school day. That's one every 26 seconds. So here's a 26-second message of
I'd have probably dropped out too had they not had Caliphone record players in school to keep me occupied.
Of how you deal with challenges at home with your family.
1,000. Correspondent Polo Sandoval reports some areas are seeing spikes.
More than 30 states reported seeing increases in new COVID cases, Florida among them. Sunshine State reported nearly 9,000 more COVID cases on Friday, a new single-day record. That, as well as the rising number of positive COVID tests, now fueling fears that Florida may be a new U.S. epicenter of the outbreak.
The head of the House Select Committee on the Coronavirus has issued a warning to his colleagues. Chairman Jim Clyburn, who also serves as the House Majority Whip, says the only way he will hold in-person hearings in the future is if all members wear face masks to protect against the coronavirus.
Face coverings are required.
Clyburn says that comes directly from the Capitol Physician and the Sergeant at Arms.
We're not going to have another meeting in a confined space for more than 15 minutes if we are not going to abide by this.
Several Republicans on the committee have declined to wear face masks, saying since they're seated 6 feet apart, they don't need to. President Trump also declines to wear a face mask at public events. Lindy Kenyon, Washington. An encounter today off the coast of Alaska. Correspondent Ryan Brown is at the Pentagon.
U.S. F-22 fighter jet intercepted